Last season, Purdue became just the second ever number 1 seed to lose to a 16, following Virginia's historic loss to UMBC in 2018. The question now, can Matt Painter's Boilermakers copycat Virginia's follow-up redemption story, cutting down the nets on the first Monday in April?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, what's up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there. He's Andy Patton. I'm Isaac Shade. We are your co-hosts, and we are so glad to be with you. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, official sportsbook of the Locked On Network. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 back in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Andy, we are just 5 weeks to the day away from tip-off of the 2023-24 season. And so to get us all ready for that, we are in the midst of our conference preview shows. So right now, today, we've been working our way through all the Power 6 schools, West Coast, A10, AAC, Mountain West, all get a full show. All 32, though, get at least a couple segments. So, folks, make sure you tune in. We got a whole playlist full of them all. But today, we get to the Big Ten. And, Andy, right out of the gate, I think anyone who would be tuning in to a conference preview in the offseason knows the big storylines. But here it is. It's 2 for 1 rolled in together. Andy Patton, will the Big Ten title drought end? Those familiar know that the Big Ten Conference has not won a national championship since the year 2000. And baked into that is the follow-up question, can Purdue be the one to do it, respond to losing to a 16 seed last year in FDU? And so can they redeem themselves and redeem the conference? Andy, is it going to happen in 23-24?
I think it's about as good a chance as they've had in a while, to be honest. I mean, two teams that are generally considered top 5 teams, at worst absolutely top 8 teams. I don't think there's anywhere that's not putting Purdue and Michigan State in the top 8. And, you know, it's fun. It's a conversation that's going to just be beat to death, basically, about the Big Ten until this happens. And I know it's frustrating. It's no fun. As somebody who follows Gonzaga, there's certainly conversations that continue to follow them around until they win a championship. So it's kind of just part of the deal, unless you're in the Big East or the ACC or the SEC. There's a lot of people, or Big 12, I should say. There's a lot of teams that just haven't been winning and haven't been doing it for a while. So it'll be interesting to see if Purdue or Michigan State, who are two very legitimate title contenders. I mean, we talk a lot on this show about continuity and perhaps whether we overrate continuity, which I think is a larger conversation that might be interesting to evaluate after this season. But Purdue brings back basically all of their starters. They add a key transfer addition. Michigan State brings back their starting lineup. They're one of the oldest teams in all of college basketball. They have a trio of really exciting freshmen joining the team. And it's really hard to look at these two teams and not think, hey, either of these teams are capable of making a deep run. Of course, there is some tournament questions. Certainly Purdue has the huge question mark after losing to a 16 seed last year, but you know, Virginia did it, and Michigan State has had a ton of tournament success. Lately, it hasn't been as successful under Tom Izzo, but last year's team made a surprising run as a 7 seed, and now, like we said, same kind of group, adding in some key players coming in the freshman class as well. So to me, these two teams are pretty well positioned to be 2 of the 5 most likely teams to win a championship. Am I taking the field over the Big Ten? Probably, because it's always hard to bet on something like that.
That would be smart to do with every conference.
It's smart to do with every conference. And realistically, I think, and this is kind of part of another conversation, I don't think there's any other teams that are super realistic championship teams out of the Big Ten. So to me, if the Big Ten is going to break that streak, it's going to be one of these two teams.
Yeah. And at the same time, I don't think either of us would have said Purdue this time last year ahead of the season. So who knows what comes out of that. And you hate it for the Big Ten, but this is the question we're all going to continue to ask until they get that proverbial monkey off their back. Can this be the year? I'm right with you. If there's ever going to be a year, it seems as good as any to be this year. Although, of course, starting next year, we'll have 18 teams in this conference. So who knows with that. And yeah, with Michigan State, you know, what a story it would be for them to be the team to have won the last national championship for the Big Ten, to finish the drought, and then also thinking back to the unfortunate events that happened on campus last year with that shooting back in February. It'd be neat story for Coach Izzo and Sparty to do that. And obviously, Andy, one of the next big storylines in the Big Ten stays with Purdue, and that is the fact that for the second year in a row, college basketball gets back the reigning national player of the year. Obviously, last year it was Oscar Tshiebwe, who entered the 22-23 season with some injury. It took a while to get going. The same doesn't seem to be true for Zach Edey. I mean, I would ordinarily, same kind of thing you just said, Big Ten versus the field, give me the field. Yeah. Zach Edey versus the field, smart money still says the field, but I have a harder time saying the field in that kind of scenario because Zach Edey is just a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine Zach Edey not putting up similarly excellent numbers this season. I think there is the argument that, hey, Fairleigh Dickinson seemed to figure out a strategy that worked to kind of neutralize Edey and neutralize that whole Purdue team. And certainly every single team in the Big Ten, and really every single team that has Purdue scheduled, has watched that tape again and again and again, and they're going to try to do similar things. But at the same time, Matt Painter's an excellent coach. These freshman guards have gotten a year older, and I think
wait, hang on. You're telling me that a year after you're a freshman, you're a year older?
You're a year older. That's right. And that freshman sophomore leap, it's always a big deal. I'm excited to see what Purdue looks like. I think it's hard to bet against Zach Edey because I just don't see how that production would slip. We did see it with Kentucky and Tshiebwe, but there was some other factors there that don't really seem to apply as much to Purdue. So I'm not advocating that you're betting Edey versus the field necessarily. That's a tough bet, but there's no player in my mind who has a better chance of taking it home. And it's really not even close. There's some talented players in the league this year, but Edey's the front runner by a significant margin.
Now, Andy, I want to stick with this postseason conversation we're having about the Big Ten, because I think so often we have it about the national title specifically. But when you start digging into the depths of NCAA tournament success, it's not been there really at any level for the Big Ten recently. And I'll say it in this way. I was reading through Blue Ribbon Yearbook's Big Ten primer for this year, and they dropped this stat, and it boggled my mind. Over the last 3 NCAA tournaments, the Big Ten has claimed 26 of the 204 available total spots in the field. That's 12.7%. But they've only earned 4 of the available 48 Sweet 16 spots. That's 8.3%. And you got to know, I mean, the vast majority of those 26 total seeds they've landed have probably been teams, a lot of them that would project to get to the Sweet 16 to the second weekend. But even just last year alone, 8 teams in the field for the Big Ten. Literally the only one that was still playing in weekend 2 was Michigan State, who you just mentioned earlier, made a run, and that was as a 7 seed. They had to knock off Marquette to get there, which was awesome. But the other 7 Big Ten teams are sitting at home. Andy, is it coincidence? Is it something with the Big Ten style of play? Is it that they all beat up on each other? What on earth is going on with this conference, not just at winning championships, but at every level?
I think there's kind of a grouping of different things. I do think that some of it is just kind of a bit random chance. It's hard to win games in the NCAA tournament. But I think beyond that, I do think there is an element of Big Ten play being a little bit different. It's officiated differently. The style of play is more unique in the Big Ten than it might be in other conferences. They don't run into a lot of teams that play styles similar to maybe like how a Gonzaga or an Arizona might play, or even teams like Virginia and how they play. Like there's just a lot of different styles of basketball, and most other power conferences have a bit more variety than the Big Ten does. And I don't think that that's like a huge problem for the Big Ten, or they desperately need to change it. But I think it's hard to imagine that that's not playing a role in some capacity in the Big Ten struggles when they get into the tournament. I mean, we see teams that are 3 seeds, 2 seeds, 1 seeds, obviously in Purdue's case. Every power conference tends to have a couple of 8, 9 seeds, and you wouldn't expect those teams to necessarily be in the Sweet 16, but it's more than just that's not making it out of the Big Ten. They have 4 or 5 seeds that are routinely losing early, and I think that it is probably there is probably a relation with that in terms of how they play. But again, I think that there's also just it's a 3-year sample, and maybe it's just a little bit wonky, but we'll see if they actually make some changes, if they find some ways to break through. But we have seen kind of a consistent stall out from Big Ten teams in the tournament. And you got to start to wonder how much the style of play in that conference has had an impact there.
Well, and one of the big factors in style of play, obviously, is the coach at the head of everything. And one of the cool things for the Big Ten is just not much turnover this year. That's always encouraging to me. Mike Rhodes at Penn State is the only new coach, as Micah Shrewsbury heads off to Notre Dame to replace Mike Bray. But as we look at this conference, 4 of the 14 schools have coaches that have been there a decade plus. Tom Izzo, Matt Painter, obviously, who we've been talking about, that is so widely respected. Fran McCaffrey at Iowa, and Chris Collins at Northwestern is entering his 11th year. And I don't think I would have guessed Collins. If you told me, hey, 4 Big Ten coaches have been at their school a decade or longer, I probably couldn't have pulled that. But then looking at, hey, anybody on the opposite side of that, though, with some real job pressure, I think Juwan Howard might be looking at that a little bit at Michigan. Anybody else for you, Andy, that jumps up that might be, that seat's a little uncomfortable right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only other one that really stands out to me is Fred Hoiberg at Nebraska. And even then, it's kind of a matter of how much do the Cornhuskers really care. Like, I mean, Fred Hoiberg they did okay last year. They did not terrible last year, I guess is the best way to put it. They didn't lose 20 games. They got all the way to 500 at points in the year, but
they finished. They were 16-16.
They did finish 500. So I think that they're in an okay spot in terms of what they're expecting out of their team and what they're getting out of their team. So I think that Fred Hoiberg's job is maybe a little bit safer than it might be at other teams that have had the level of performance that they have had. So I don't see a ton of changes coming anytime super soon for this conference. I think Juwan probably gets another year unless things really fall off the rails this year, which, to be fair, could happen with this team. They had a really rough offseason. A lot of it was not his fault, but that doesn't really matter. Coaches are who lose their
not
job.
Getting Caleb Love. That's the admissions office.
Yeah, the admissions office, hurt them from Caleb Love's perspective. Last year, it hurt them with Terrence Shannon Jr., and that's not Juwan Howard's fault. But if the team continues to struggle, they're not going to fire their admissions department. They're going to fire their head coach. That's what's going to happen. So I do think there's pressure on Juwan, certainly. Olivia Nakamwa is a great addition for this team. I think they have some opportunities to maybe not, climb all the way up into the top 5 of the conference and get a high seed in the tournament. I think that's a pretty lofty expectation for this team. But I think if Juwan does at least enough with the cards that he's been dealt, I think he'll keep his job. But he's skating on thinner ice than he has been in the past, for sure.
Yeah, and back to Nebraska, the fact that we're finding a silver lining in getting to 500 after 3 straight 20-loss seasons, that tells you all you need to know. And I think how you said it sums it up perfectly. Yeah. Do they really care, or is that just kind of, hey, we're good, It's tough.
Well, Isaac, we know who's at the top of the Big Ten. We talked about Purdue and Michigan State. We kind of know who's at the bottom of the Big Ten. We talked about that a little bit there, but there's a lot of teams kind of lumped into the middle of the Big Ten, and we're going to talk about that. How will we separate those teams? We're going to do that for you in just a second. But first, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Athletic Brewing. And now time for your game changer of the week. Again, brought to you by the Athletic Brewing Company. Much like Sam Hartman's final drive heroics for Notre Dame against Duke, Athletic Brewing Company has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good. They are full of flavor and well-crafted, just like a full-strength beer. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you, or you can buy them online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer, exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out, of course, to those everyday listeners. You all know who you are, and we very much appreciate you. Folks, college football is here, and Locked On is kicking up our coverage with Locked On College Football Kickoff Live, airing every Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern on every single Locked On College YouTube channel. Find the Locked On College Football Kickoff Live every Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern time on any Locked On College YouTube channel. Folks, you're not going to want to miss this. Isaac, let's get right into it here with the Big Ten. We talked about the top of the conference. We talked about the bottom of the conference, and we took our best attempt at tiering out the conference, breaking up the teams, the 14 teams, into 5 different tiers. And this was tough. This was a tough exercise. There's a lot of teams that kind of mesh together in the middle of the conference. We could see teams pretty easily jump from 9th to 3rd or 10th to 5th, whatever, because there's just a lot of teams kind of all grouped closely together. So why don't you kick us off talking about those first couple of tiers that we have here for the Big Ten?
Yeah, it feels like synonyms of each other here. Mm-hmm. It's like you're just trying to find different words, but you could plug in different teams for it. So here's how we tiered this thing out. Purdue and Michigan State at number 1. I've got Illinois, Maryland, and Indiana all in that second tier together. Feels like none of them are quite up to where Purdue or Michigan State is, but they do feel a slight cut above the rest for me. I think based on some of the talent they've got. Like I think about an Indiana, for example. Like I don't know that the depth is necessarily fully there, but like if Mackenzie Mbako really hits the stud freshman who decommitted from Duke and committed to Mike Woodson, like there are all sorts of possibilities there. If Xavier Johnson's finally healthy to run the show, like I just see that if Terrence Shannon Jr. can be what Brad Underwood needs him to be for Illinois, there's just a lot of those. That's like, I think it's there, but it's a lot of what ifs. Beyond that, I would we would have that third tier, which is Wisconsin, Northwestern, and Ohio State, which is coming off that weirdly disappointing last season. I'm still bamboozled by last season for the Buckeyes, but I think all of those project to be either safely in the tournament or probably in that bubble conversation. Fourth tier, Iowa, Rutgers, and that Michigan team we were just talking about. Weird to have Michigan down this low, but from a talent standpoint, Andy, it seems like that's where they're at. And then kind of rounding out the bottom, we kind of have already talked about at least Nebraska, but then also looking at Penn State, bringing in Mike Rhodes. I think it's weird because they have some talent, and they could be a little bit of a surprise in some ways, but I just don't fully see it. And then Minnesota. Okay, we'll just leave that one there. So, Andy, as you said, we feel like we got our bookends, but how do we separate out this mush in the middle? Let me give you just some stats to back it up, and then I'd love to hear your response to it. So I was really thinking about the eye test of these bookends in the middle. Purdue, at barttorvik.com, Purdue preseason is number 1 in the nation, Michigan State 8. On the back end, Minnesota is 131, Penn State is 153. So we got kind of these extremes, but right smack dab in the middle, the other 10 teams fall between number 29 and 62. How on earth do you suss all that out, Andy? It's wild.
Yeah, it's a really unique conference. And I think you look at some of the additions and subtractions from some of these teams. And I kind of remember looking through who are the transfers that came in, who left, and trying to find teams that maybe it seems like there was an obvious, oh, this team got a lot better or this team got a lot worse. And even then, just a lot of these teams in the middle kind of feel like they're going to be similarly productive. And you don't know. Certainly there are some additions that could come in that make a bigger impact than we're expecting, or certainly some teams that maybe some of the guys they lost are going to hurt them in a more significant way than we're potentially projecting. But to me, looking at this from tier 2, you have Illinois listed here to the bottom of tier 3 at Ohio State, or even the start of tier 4 with Iowa. Like all of those teams, Illinois, Maryland, Indiana, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Ohio State, Iowa, like that group of teams right there. And I'm comfortable tossing Michigan in there as well. Like there's a ton of movement that could happen. A few of those teams, I think I'd be pretty surprised if they finished 3rd, but not all of them. Like I'll talk about it later. Wisconsin's a team I think could finish in the top 3 or 4 of this conference. Ohio State certainly disappointed last year, but if they bounce back with some of the additions they brought in, some of that freshman class, like there's a lot of teams here that could really kind of make that leap. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how it does play out, how it works stylistically, how much continuity matters in the conference. Wisconsin brings back most of their 9 of their top 10 scorers, but this wasn't a very good team last year. So is the continuity how important is that going to be? You look at teams like Illinois and Northwestern who bring back, really, really key players in Terrence Shannon Jr. and Boo Buie. Like that's really impactful. We know that veteran guards it makes a huge difference, but again, these are teams that maybe didn't perform up to snuff last year. Northwestern definitely did, but they also lost a lot of other players around Boo Buie. So it's going to be really interesting. I'm excited to see how the kind of middle of this conference plays out, because I think there are teams that we might project 8th, or that other people in the industry might expect to finish 8th or 10th, that could realistically finish 4th, and it might not even feel that shocking.
No, I mean, here's a great example from the end of last season. You talked about Boo Buie. Northwestern's final game of the regular season. They were playing Rutgers. If they had won the game, they were going to be the 2 seed in the Big Ten tournament. If they lost the game, they were the 9 seed. Like, I could completely see that kind of scenario happening. And it's just so stinking wild, Andy. And I just lost my train of thought where I was going. So we just keep on. Ultimately, here's what I was going to ask you. Andy, let's say Purdue and Michigan State are who we think they are. If you had to call it right now, who would you have as the 3rd seed in the Big Ten tournament?
I think probably Indiana is the direction that I would go. I think Indiana, I really like the front court of Ware and Renaud, depending on, we'll have to see how that works. But the fit on paper makes a lot of sense. If Ware can stretch the floor, Renaud's great at scoring with around the basket. Mbako, if he can play the 3, is just a really, really difficult player for anybody in that conference to guard. But again, I'll go with Indiana. But if you pick Maryland, if you pick Wisconsin, if you pick Illinois, I think all those are reasonable picks as well.
Yeah, I think I would take Illinois, but Indiana is my second choice with that too. So that said, Andy, when we look at conference tournament and regular season champs, is it Purdue and Michigan State, or do you have somebody else?
Yeah, it's Purdue and Michigan State. I have Purdue winning the regular season. I think that just going through the regular season, having to handle Zach Edey on a day-to-day basis.
Zeddy. That's his new nickname.
Yeah, I like Zeddy. That's kind of a fun nickname. Anyway, I think it's going to be really hard to handle him and that team, that experience, the coaching from Matt Painter in the regular season. But in the conference tournament, give me Michigan State. I think by the time we get to there, the 3 freshmen coming off the bench and Fears and Booker and Cohen Carr are going to be really kind of playing at their best level. Izzo's development has always been solid. And I think as a key starting 5 with so many veteran guys, along with those 3 freshmen potentially playing up to their, expected level by the time March rolls around, I think that team's going to win the conference tournament.
Well, Andy, I'm right with you. Same teams, same reasoning. Nothing else I need to say to it. But you know what? We do need to figure out who's going to win all these postseason awards, who's going to be on our first teams, all of that stuff. And let me tell you, Andy, I had a lot of trouble with this. I know you did too, because there's so many experienced players. There's so many experienced, talented players in this conference, meaning we're going to leave off some phenomenal basketball players on the first team. You're all going to be yelling at us. So who do Andy and I have making it? And we're going to give you some hardware to take home, all of that coming up. But first, this episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on all the action than right now. The app is super easy to use. You can bet on all sorts of stuff like spreads, player props, over-under, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, Andy, it's time to hand out some awards, some hardware to take home, put on your mantle, and feel like an absolute stud. So to do that, we're going to start by naming our first team All Big Ten. Why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, again, like you said, tough to pick here. I think there's a few fairly obvious candidates, a few spots that could have gone 5, 6, 8, 10 different ways potentially. Obviously, Zach Edey, no more conversation needed there. He's going to be a first teamer almost certainly. Terrence Shannon and Boo Buie, I kind of mentioned them right there at Illinois and Northwestern, some veteran guards coming back who should put up really productive numbers again. And then for me, I went Jameer Young at Maryland. I think Maryland's a kind of a sneaky team that we haven't talked a ton about on here, but I think there's some excitement about them keeping Young around, keeping a couple other key starters around as well. And then I'm going Ace Baldwin, transfer coming in, following his coach Mike Rhodes from VCU to Penn State. I think Ace Baldwin could realistically lead the conference in assists. I think he could be an all-defensive player as well. And I think that's going to be good enough for him to potentially sneak onto this list as well.
Well, here's what's funny. We just said how many different players could be on this list, and a bunch are going to get left out. I had exactly 4 of the same 5 as you, Andy, with Edey, Boo Buie, Terrence Shannon, and Jameer Young. The only one I had different was Tyson Walker at Michigan State. I just, when I'm thinking through this, I'm like, man, if I have Michigan State as one of the top 2 teams in this conference, who's going to be their best player this year? And I think it is Tyson Walker coming back. Funny thing is, if it's not him, I would actually go with AJ Hoggard. But the reason I didn't, I think his numbers at the ceiling have the potential to be better than Tyson Walker, but I think his floor is also lower. So if Hoggard could find consistency, I might switch these guys. But man, Tyson Walker, I just expect to be the model of consistency for what I expect to be a top 2 team in this conference. So give me Walker. And I love where college basketball is at, that this list is all seniors. How about it? It's awesome.
Very cool. Let's talk player of the year very, very quickly. I got Zach
1, 2, 3.
Zach Edey.
Zach Edey. All right.
It has to be. There's no more conversation there. If he doesn't win the regulars or the national player of the year, there's still almost no way he doesn't win Big Ten player of the year.
Yeah, I think you were joking around before we started recording today. It would be malpractice to vote for anyone else.
Yeah, you can't pick somebody else. That's insane.
Well, Andy, what about coach of the year? Who did you go with for that?
Yeah, definitely more options for coach of the year. I actually went with Kevin Willard at Maryland. Again, we didn't talk much about Maryland earlier, but I think this is a team that could realistically sneak their way all the way up into the top, maybe third, fourth, somewhere in there with Indiana, with Illinois. I think if they move up to 3, Kevin Willard did a good job last year. Like we said, they kept Young, they kept Julian Reese, they keep Donta Scott. They're all back. They got some fun guys coming in, some exciting freshmen. I think there's a reasonable chance that this team climbs up into the top 4 or 5, maybe even top 3 of this conference. Wow. And that might be enough for Willard to take home this award in one of his first seasons at Maryland.
I'm going to go with Matt Painter. And I know it's like, okay, cool. They're awesome. Yeah, but you still got to coach it. And here's why, Andy. I think, number one, Matt Painter is so well liked and respected by the coaching brotherhood. The idea of the bounce back, like what it takes mentally to come back from what happened last year, and then managing these massive expectations that are going to be on them. Matt Painter's never been to a Final Four, just one Elite 8. Purdue as a program hadn't been to the Final Four since like 1980, I think it is. And so I just see Matt Painter with that bounce back, getting the sympathy from his peers, and I see him getting that victory.
Yeah, I think that's a very solid choice, and I think if he coaches,
thank you, Andy. I appreciate you saying that.
If he coaches this team to a number 1 seed in the Big Ten, it's going to be really hard to ignore it because of all the other stuff that comes with coaching the year after losing a game like that. Looking at transfer of the year, not a surprise for me since I picked him on my first team. I'm going with Ace Baldwin again. I think there's a real chance he leads the Big Ten in assists. I think there's a real chance he's at least on the all defensive first team. Maybe doesn't win defensive player of the year because of somebody like Edey, but I think there's a lot of great transfers in the conference. I think Khalil Ware is an interesting potential option there. I think Olivia Nakamura at Michigan's a good option as well, but I'm going with Ace Baldwin at Penn State.
Yep, that's who I had too. But so I'm actually going to go with, since you took him, I'm going to go with Kamwa, who people are going to most recently remember as being the Duke killer in the NCAA tournament last year for Tennessee. Not all, it's so hard to gauge because he's coming out of the Rick Barnes system, which is so much more, a little bit slower paced, defensive minded. What can he be now playing for Juwan Howard? There's a big potential for him to go wacky in Ann Arbor this season. Andy, what about freshman of the year? You talked about Khalil Ware at Indiana as a potential transfer. Might his teammate top your list here?
Yeah, he does. And it's tough for me because I think those 3 freshmen at Michigan State are so excellent, but I don't know that any of them are going to start. I think Tom Izzo is going to go with his veteran guys that he has. So for me, I'm going with Mbako. Again, I'm also not 100% sure Mbako is going to start at Indiana. It kind of depends if they're willing to play him at the 3, but if he can handle the ball well enough to play the 3, if he can handle defensive assignments well enough to play the 3, he can space the floor. He's athletic enough to push guys around. He's a matchup nightmare, top 10 player coming out of that class. Again, was going to go to Duke before Filipowski and Mark Mitchell came back. And I think Mbako is going to make a big difference for this Indiana team right away. And I think that's enough for him to take home freshman of the year, despite the Big Ten having a significant amount of talented freshmen this year.
Yeah, I think the wise money is on either Mbako or Xavier Booker at Michigan State. As you said, I don't know that Booker will be starting. It's either probably he or Mady Sissoko. Yeah. But man, as 2 like top 10, 11 guys coming into the season, I really think Booker could have a big year. I've heard Coach Izzo talk about he needs to gain some strength, but it's comparing him to like Jaren Jackson coming in, and that's a massive comparison. So give me Xavier Booker coming in to East Lansing.
I wanted to do a quick shout out for a dark horse I have there, which is Deshaun Harris-Smith, who I think is could reasonably start at the 2 for Maryland. And I think if he starts top 35 player, he could be a guy who kind of sneaks into that conversation.
Because the opportunity is massive in these kind of votes.
So important. Looking at 6th man of the year here, I'm going AJ Storr at Wisconsin, transfer from St. John's, guy who shot 40% from deep, was such a desperate need for Wisconsin to bring in somebody who could stretch the floor. He's not projected to start right now. That could certainly change. But if he's coming off the bench, puts up even similar numbers, 9 points, 10 points, shoots 41% from deep, and Wisconsin makes a little bit of noise, I think there's a real chance that he wins that award. My honorable mention is Mason Gillis, who is not projected right now to start at Purdue, despite starting 15 games for him last year. I think that Gillis is going to be great again for the Boilermakers and could take home that award as well.
Interestingly, I'm not convinced. I don't know if it's going to be Gillis or Caleb First starting for Purdue, but my 6th man is whoever doesn't start between those two. So if I'm either right with you or saying Caleb First. We'll wait to see how those roles play out.
All right, closing out the show real quick with our discussion on how many Big Ten teams are actually going to make the big dance. Which teams are going to get that opportunity to break this 20-plus year streak for the Big Ten? And we set the over-under at 7. And Isaac, I'm going under, or excuse me, we set it at 7.5, and I'm going under at 7. The teams that I got in are Purdue and Michigan State. Of course, I also have Indiana, Maryland, and Illinois, and then Wisconsin and Iowa, which means I have out of the tournament Northwestern, Ohio State, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, Penn State, and Rutgers.
Well, Andy, here's what's funny. Our numbers are the same, but we did different math to get there. The math teacher always wants to see you show your work. I've got 7 teams as well. I'm also taking the under, but I have Boo Buie and Northwestern getting into the tournament. I didn't have Iowa quite getting there. That's the only difference I had.
Well, Isaac, always fun to do these conference previews. We're getting closer and closer. It is October, folks. So excited to finally be a month away from the actual start of the college basketball season. The Big Ten is going to be a really fun conference to watch this year. We've got a lot more of these coming your way later this week, going into next week as well. We still got some of those big teams to discuss, Pac-12, Mountain West, a handful of other ones that we haven't gotten to yet, and a lot of those smaller conferences to get to as well. So stick with us here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube. Go hit that subscribe button there if you have not done so yet. Thank you so much for listening. We got it right today, but apologies to the lawyer family as always. And of course, until next time, peace out.